everybody. Welcome back to another episode of JaAR. JaAR, for those of you that may be new, stands for Joe
and Amy.
Review. This is our weekly show where we review the Magic stories. And it may be our last for a little while. We're not sure. Stay tuned to the end and we will tell you all about it. But this week, we are reviewing side story number 4 for Zendikar Rising, Hunger by Brandon O'Brien, and episode 5 of the Zendikar Rising stories, The Two Guardians, once again by A.T. Greenblatt. My quick review at the top. For the side story, for Hunger, I loved it. I really enjoyed it. I think that it's the best of the side stories, including the Akiri and Zareth ones, which I thought were very good. But I think this is the best of the side stories. I highly encourage that you read it. And for the main story, I think it's important that you read it. I think it did a good job of describing what happens to Zendikar, one way or another. So I think it's important that it be read, and we will talk more in depth on more of my opinions on that towards the end. But so my quick review is definitely read the side story, and you should read the main story, episode 5. What about you, Amy?
So for me, it's kind of flipped. I still think you should read both stories, for sure. But my quick review of the side story is it was side story material. It was fine. And my quick review of the main story was surprisingly good. And we'll get to that. Yeah, we will. So we say that, we give you our review, our quick reviews at the top, because if you have not had a chance to read these stories yet, we encourage that you do that first, and then come back here and join us, especially because we always say, with this series we review, we don't summarize. And so if you want to get the full force of the stories, we're not going to give that to you here. We're going to talk to you about it, and we want you to be able to join us in that discussion, but we're just going to be spoiling things left and right without any context necessarily whatsoever. We don't tell you what happened in the story, we analyze what happened in the story.
And we want you to be able to read it for yourself as well. Right. So, please feel free to go do that, and then we would love if you would come back here and join us for the remainder. So, on to the full review itself. We start with side story number 4, Hunger, where we join Anawan, the Ruin Thief, I think is the rest of his moniker. I didn't write that down, but because we just have Anawan, the character. This story, I think, spoke to me a little bit more than you.
Yeah.
Because...
Which is okay, because the other story spoke more to me.
Yes, and we will hear much more from Amy, I'm assuming, in that later story, more so than me, because I'll talk more at the end on that one. But for me, for this story, I guess I'll take the lead on this one. Mm-hmm. But this story, I felt like Anawan was in situations that I personally have been in many times in my life. And so because of that, I connected a lot more to this story. And again, we'll hear more from Amy about the second story later. But that's kind of the theme of this JaAR episode, is that like I connected with Anawan, Amy connected with Nahiri and Nissa, and we'll get into all of it. But for Anawan was a person who saw a group that he wanted to be a part of. And he was standing on the outside, wanting to be a part of that group, knowing that that group could help him, but also that he could help that group, right? He was aware of his own strengths and abilities and etc., and still was hiding. He had to hide away and watch from afar, trying to be stealthy. And then you see a little bit of his awkwardness as well, because he like takes out his notes that he wants to use and go research in the Skyclaves, and he drops them all over the floor. And it's like, yep, nope, I got you, dude. I feel you. Yep, I get it. Then once he actually makes contact with that group, not through his own wishes, as he kind of gets dragged over there and found out, he wants to be a part of this group, and a lot of them distrust him. Because he's a vampire, and they're not. They're core and warriors and etc., and he's a vampire. And they not only distrust him, they treat him like garbage. And he is trying so desperately to fit in. And again, I've been there. So this part of this aspect of this story spoke to me a lot. Because Anawan basically showed up and kind of prostrated himself and was like, I want to be with you guys. And they're like, no. And he's like, please, seriously, I need to go where you guys are going. I would love to join you. I could help. Please believe me. And so as they got there, they being the whole group, Anawan was purposefully willing to take on more of a burden than the rest of them. He was carrying all of their gear, he was climbing up these rocks and stuff, because he knew that that is what he had to do, or at least he felt, I should say, that is what he had to do to prove himself to these discerning expeditionary folk.
Yeah.
And it sucks. It sucks to watch somebody have to go through all of that, because the real response is, it's not worth it. You're worth more than the crap that you're taking from all of those people right now. That's just how it goes. And yet this is what he felt he had to do, and was ultimately, I guess, arguably successful for it. But, and again, I've been in that situation. That was parts of my life where there were groups of people that I wanted to break into, not necessarily because those people were good people, those individuals, but that they were where I wanted to be. And so you become involved with those people because you want to learn about where they are. You want to be able to get to where they are. And then when you're the one who is in the position they're in, you won't do what they're doing to the people underneath them, etc. That's not 100% an allegory to this story in that way, but that's where my information comes from. That's where my connection to this story stems. That there are people who are in charge or in positions of power or just above you in general. They're where you want to be, and you're willing to put up with some crap from them. And please don't misunderstand when I say, I am not like a life coach or something. These things worked out for me, and I'm grateful that they worked out for me. That does not mean that I'm saying that it will absolutely work out for anyone who tries it, and that you should go out and try it.
I don't think anyone can ever make that kind of a statement.
No, but
this is definitely going to work for you. Like, that's just not realistic.
Right. So please take that into account when you're in situations. Look internally as well and realize what is fair, what you're willing to put up with, what's acceptable. I wasn't, and please don't misunderstand with my own situation. I was not beaten, I was not abused, right? This is not something where I was like, well, whatever, I'm willing to get the crap kicked out of me as long as they like me eventually. No. So please don't let that go further than it should. And take stock in yourself for those things. And understand that I'm not a professional either. So, I'm not perfect. I may have done the wrong thing. But it worked out for me. I was able to get to the point that I wanted to get to with those people. And then when they left and I was in charge, I knew what I did and did not want to do based on my interactions with those folk. I also find out in this story where Anawan has a moment with Tarsa alone when everybody else is asleep, and Tarsa actually gives Anawan the time of day. I don't know what that is about people, but that's absolutely also a thing, is that in a group, people will band together and treat you like garbage, and yet if you can get one of those people alone, they may actually be a decent human being.
Right.
It's weird how that works. That really all that they want is companionship and acceptance. And they're just doing so at the expense of you and your feelings at first. And then when they have the opportunity to be alone with you, they'll still sit there and ask you questions and try to learn about you as a person, especially if you are willing to put up with a lot of crap.
Right.
Because they are unwilling to put up with that crap. That's why they treat you so poorly sometimes. Because they're doing so to try to fit in their own way, and just constantly wanting that validation from their peers. And so they're getting that validation in all the negative ways that don't make sense by treating other people like crap. And yet it's giving them what they want. They just don't realize that if it's a true relationship that they're in with these other folk, they're going to get that validation whether or not they're treating somebody else like garbage in the process.
Right.
So that was this story for me, by the way, if that's unclear. I appreciated seeing that, and it felt good to reminisce back to those moments where I put up with a lot of crap and then ended up in a good place afterwards and felt good about it. Although, I will say I can absolutely see where that could be the exact opposite for somebody else.
Yeah.
Where they would read this story and feel like they were Anawan in the beginning, but then it never became Anawan at the end.
Yeah, that was my sort of situation.
And so, for that reason, I could understand if people don't enjoy this story as much as I did. But I really did. It really spoke to me and my personal experiences. And so, you know, I'm aware of my bias there. And as always, if people are comfortable sharing, I would love to hear from anybody in the comments who wants to talk about that. Whether you read this story and felt bad for Anawan, whether you read this story and felt like he was dumb for putting up with as much as he did because it's not worth it. Because that's arguably the correct answer, is that it's just not worth being treated like crap like that.
Right.
But again, for me, for the places that I wanted to go.
But it's worth showing the people who think it makes sense to treat you like crap that it doesn't make sense to treat you like crap.
Right. It doesn't affect you. It doesn't bother you. You're better than them in that way, in many ways. So yeah, I agree with that too. There were basically, there's not really a lot to talk about with this story. I just thought it was really good. That part of it spoke to me a lot. And there were 2 paragraphs that we wanted to read out.
Yeah.
That I wrote down. I quoted them because they spoke to us, and they both of them really spoke to you, and then the second half of it kind of spoke to me more so than the first. Okay. But we can read these parts out. So there were things we hoped to learn. This is from Anawan's perspective. There were things he hoped to learn. See, I already messed it up. I'll start over. There were things he hoped to learn. Things he secretly hoped would regain him favor. Perhaps the Skyclaves contained secrets about Zendikar that he could compare to the Eldrazi histories that would reveal ancient magic behind the Royal, or even unlock the secret of creating new blood chiefs by pure accident.
That's fascinating to me, and it's great that he was sort of formulating these, you know, like history-based theories in his mind, and he was like, well, these people will like me if, you know, I'm able to like historically prove something, you know,
well,
which doesn't really make any sense,
right.
But it's still awesome.
I don't think he meant these people meaning the other explorers that he was traveling with when he said more renowned. Okay. I think he meant among his fellow vampires.
Okay.
I think. That's how I read that, at least.
Good. I think that would be healthier.
Yes, I agree. Continuing on. Maybe their rising would be the beginning of a whole new era of calamity that he could prevent as penance for failing with the Eldrazi. So that's the end of that first section there.
I don't know. Maybe you understand that a bit better than I do. Maybe you can explain that to
again,
me more.
To me, it speaks back to his life previously that we don't know about. For failing with the Eldrazi. And he mentions wanting more blood chiefs. There's only Drana. She's the only one. Which, by the way, no stories on Drana.
Yeah, I was really mad that there was no Drana in this story.
Yeah.
Because I was really hoping there would be.
Yeah. That, the closest we get is the fact that blood chiefs are mentioned here. And that's it, because Drana is the last blood chief. That's her title, right? And it's not one that she's happy about. There should be more blood chiefs, but and that's, I guess, what Anawan is trying to do. But that's what
trying to say that he should be one, or that
no, that there should be more, and that he can help based on his skills and his abilities. That he could maybe create more, and that it would be, So that's what I read that as.
Okay.
Then to continue on. And while he did cling to the idea that it would bring him glory to be the first to learn all of this, he was also tired. So eager to heal the world, to never see it suffer again. Just to be able to study it, without each truth revealing a wound on the land. To be at peace with himself, with his studies, with the very soil of Zendikar. That last part was incredible when we read it. What a great, like, and that's it of the quoted sections. So that's from this story. If for whatever reason you didn't read it, that was my favorite portion of this whole thing. Because one, it still does a good job of tying it slightly back into the Zendikar Rising stories.
Right.
Because Nissa and Nahiri arguably trying to do the same things.
Right.
And so now you hear that it's not just the big bad planeswalkers,
right.
that there are individual denizens on the plane who are also like, hey, maybe we can do something here.
They also, want their home to not be destroyed.
Right.
Shocking.
And they're not just sitting around with their hands folded going, gosh, I hope someone helps me. Right? They're like actually taking things into their own hands because
and really mulling over some deep ass, almost out there ass shit as ways to try and actually help.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even if it's not a viable option for them, like even if they're definitely not going to be able to do that, it's still thoughts going through their minds because they want to.
Yeah. Yeah. It was so well written. It was so well done. I appreciated that portion. I mean, like I said, I appreciated the story, but that portion really spoke to me. That part was really great.
Yeah. I really.
Here, I can give this to you. I like I said, that part was the fact that he mentions he was tired, right? The world is a scary place to live in, and I'm not necessarily just talking about Zendikar there,
right?
Weirdly, but also with Zendikar, right? For Anawan, his world, Zendikar is a scary place for him to live, and he's trying his best to do anything to make this better for himself.
Arguably, that section reminds me a lot of the types of things that you like to talk about a lot, which is it's relatable to the real world.
Oh yeah.
In that we all are sitting there going, okay, what's going to help us specifically be successful in life? And what are you willing to do to get to that point? Also realizing that it's just as important to care about the well-being of the world at large, or your community specifically, or your state, or whatever, or your country, and sort of how you fit into it.
Yeah. What are your responsibilities there? Whether you put them on yourself or whether they're actually your responsibilities. Yeah.
So he said in the previous paragraph that we read, like, he wants to create a new era of calamity so that he can, like, punish whoever is responsible for the Eldrazi bullshit. But then he said, and I want the glory and the notoriety and the praise and the success that comes with all of that. But at the same time, I just want my home to be what it ought to be.
Yeah.
I just want, like, the only reason why he wants to fight, the only reason why he wants to create this problem, essentially, which is what, like, a calamity would be, is because he's so upset about the condition that his home is in, and isn't that just exactly what us as millennials kind of, and maybe just everyone living in the world at this point in time feels. We all want to be able to achieve this level of success, but we are all aware of the fact that that is such a difficult thing and is so sort of insignificant in comparison.
So the last thing I wanted to just point out about this story, kind of going back to what I was talking about in the beginning of this, is that Anawan does have this story end the way that you would want this story to end. It's somewhat of a cliche, but it worked for me with my experience, but you had that moment with when Anawan saved their lives and came through in the clutch with the potions or whatever it was that he had found in the vials and was able to dissolve this Hydra and save them all. They accepted him again. And there was that moment of Anawan being like, it's okay, I'll carry the petrified heads down. And one of the expeditioners says, no, we share the load, which is the opposite of what happened on the way up, where Anawan was like, yes, I will carry everything. One, because you've asked me to, because you're being terrible to me. But right. Two, because I'm proving to you that it's okay. That I can, I'm proving my worth, which is going to have to be 10 times more than any of you are doing, because you don't trust me or you don't believe in me. So I have to do all this extra work for you to believe in me. And then at the end, they believe in him enough to say, no, we are a group, we share the load. And that's when Tarsa, the leader basically of that group, says, you can be our fourth anytime. Right. Because they had lost their fourth to this Hydra, and had then, through this story, found their fourth in Anawan. Which, I don't even know that necessarily that's what Anawan was trying to get out of this whole situation. That, Anawan just wanted a group to go with to go to this place. And I guess maybe it was what Anawan wanted because he wanted to continue the research, right? Continue exploring these skyclaves and learning more in analyzing the markings and stuff on the walls. So maybe I misunderstood. I thought it was just like a one-trip thing. But he seemed pleased with the fact that he, it mentioned all he wanted was belonging, or finding a sense of belonging. And he did. He did at the end here. He did eventually. And that's the happy ending, so to speak, right? Like I said, it's a bit cliche. And sometimes that's not great. But I think it's fine here. I think the last time we've seen this type of a trope used was back in Arlen Cord's story from Innistrad, Eldritch Moon.
Eldritch Moon.
It was the first story of Eldritch Moon, in fact, if I remember correctly, which, God help me if I do, that I remember that so vividly.
Yeah.
Because it's not something I went back to look up, but it was Arlen Cord, when finally revealing herself to be a werewolf, was shunned by her teacher, and then saved her teacher's life, and then her teacher was like, okay, I guess you're fine, right? It's that same idea of it's not exactly the same, but it's the same idea of I don't trust you.
Stupid
racism. You saved my life. I trust you. You know, and
it's stupid racism bullshit where it's
oh my God,
I don't like how you look, so therefore you're a bad person.
Right.
Oh, you saved my life. I guess you're not a bad person.
Right.
You just look a way that I don't like.
Right. And because it's a story, because it has to wrap up nicely, you have that moment where Tarsa flat out says you did great today. You helped us out. You can be our fourth anytime. In the real world, just again, from my own experience, that doesn't happen. You just kind of look back one day and you're like, oh, I'm here. I did it. Right? You start, there are those people who treated you poorly and they don't treat you poorly anymore. Now they just accept you, and it's not something where they're going to say, hey, you know what? You're a good guy after all. I'm so sorry that I did all those terrible things to you.
They usually don't vocalize that part.
Right. It's just that you, by the nature of being there, you have gotten to a point where they just start treating you with respect the whole time, as opposed to only on occasion or only when nobody else is around or only this caveat or only that caveat. It just kind of comes to be in that way. So it's no
thanks.
Yeah. And that's perfectly fine. It's not something that I look forward to ever having to do again, hopefully. But
Same.
At the time that I did it, right, I was really young. I was trying to fit in, and it eventually it just got to a point where I was the person who was in charge. I stayed around for long enough and found my place where I belonged, not with those people who shunned me, by the way. let's not misunderstand. They were gone, and I was still left, and I had faced the adversity, if you will, all the way through, and knew that it was going to be a hell of a lot easier for me to do my job when I wasn't facing constant adversity, because I already knew that I had done it while facing constant adversity. So it was, that's how I personally was able to grow from a similar experience. But yeah, I think that's the end of this particular story, right? I don't think there's anything much more to say.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that, it's the kind of thing, at least for me, where, I've gotten to a point where the people that I no longer want to spend time with are the people who think that I owe them whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are a lot of people that owe me something because of everything that I've lost in my life.
Right.
And they don't deserve to get anything back from me. So they're not anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Like,
I think so.
They've repeatedly hurt me, and so that's the end. I'm now to a point where I'm not going to try and win their approval. I'm not going to try and show them time and time again that I'll put my neck on the line for them, because they're not willing to do even the bare minimum for me.
Right.
So they can go fuck themselves.
Yeah. And like I said, you have to find that balance between they're not worth it, which is one end, and you have to be willing to get to that point, versus, hey, this isn't as big of a deal, like, they're just verbally saying whatever, and it's not that big of a deal, because I know where I want to be, and I somewhat have to go through them to get there, and maybe it's somewhere in between, maybe it is one of those polar opposites, and yeah, I hope that anybody who is going through that now, at any point, realizes that, if it's somewhere that you want to be, and it's not an unsafe environment for you to be in to get there, that you can do it. Just keep with it. That's all. So, yeah, that's all I had to say on this particular story. So we'll move on next to episode 5, The Two Guardians. Again, as I said earlier, by A.T. Greenblatt. This one was different, as we mentioned earlier. We can talk about, I think, Amy, you wanted to start, because it starts, right, we have the perspectives of the 3 planeswalkers throughout this story, from start to finish, starting right where we left off with the fight, in fact, like, bleeding slightly into the end of the last story by, like, a sentence or two, and it starts with something that you wanted to talk about, which was Nissa, like, blaming herself, talking about the elementals, I couldn't think of the word, the elementals that are all around her, that are helping her, and she's talking about her and the elementals versus Nahiri and Jace, and talking about how she blames herself for the problems on Zendikar that she accidentally caused.
Right.
And so you wanted to talk about that.
And, yeah. It's very frustrating, because from the beginning of this, I have had a lot of opinions about why things were written, or the way things were written, and just having issues with it, just not being okay with the fact that both Nahiri and Nissa blame themselves so much for what happened on Zendikar. But I think you made a good point, where you were like, okay, but the reason why they blame themselves is because they're the only ones who give a damn. Like, Soren and Ugin might have been the ones that caused this whole fucking mess, but they don't give a shit at all, so they're not gonna feel guilty about it.
Yeah.
But it just made me really pissed off that these 2 amazing women are the ones who feel like they've caused this whole mess, even though it has nothing to do with either of them.
Mm-hmm.
It has to do with the arrogance and apathy of Ugin and Soren.
Even arrogance and then apathy. I would say. Like, it's arrogance of like, well, whatever, we'll just put them here, it'll be fine, we'll trap them away, you're great, keep them there. And then the apathy of like, oh, they're back, well, we're busy.
Well, I mean, it was apathy from the beginning, because they didn't care about Zendikar to begin with, otherwise they wouldn't have put them there. And they didn't care about Nahiri to begin with, otherwise they wouldn't have put her there.
Yeah.
To be isolated, to basically be in solitary confinement for the sake of making sure that they didn't escape.
Right. It's like, well, you stay here with these guys, and, you know, if they ever come out, let us know. We'll totally be right there.
Right. And Nahiri cared so much about her plane that she agreed to stay in solitary confinement for millennia so that she could take care of these fucking Eldrazi that should have never been put there.
She cared about her plane. She also trusted her friends / mentors in Soren and Ugin, and we then see what came of that and how she felt about that after the fact.
Right. And so from the beginning of all of this, I've been pissed about all of these things, right? But it wasn't until last week that I sat there and said to myself, I wonder if all of this is just going to allude to trauma responses. Nahiri's trauma response to being held for that long a period of time, being manipulated, all of that. Nissa's as well, because she let the Eldrazi free because she knew that they were causing problems for the plane, and then it was a traumatic experience for her having done that and like unleashing this terrible damage upon the plane. And then the trauma response that Zendikar had to the Eldrazi, right?
Okay.
And I didn't want to talk about it last week because I wanted to wait for this story to kind of confirm that theory.
Sure.
And I feel like it absolutely did. I didn't like it in the beginning because it took so long to finally get there. So I'll kind of let you go back to the notes and we can work our way to that point.
Sure.
Now that I've brought up that theory.
Sure. Well, you mentioned, you know, these two amazing women. That was a phrase that you used, which I appreciate. And we'll get back to that in just a second. Basically, you have the bit of fighting in the beginning where Nissa is bringing the elementals towards Nahiri. Nahiri is fighting with the swords and the stone and etc. and it's not really doing anything. Jace is, we find out later when we cut to Jace's perspective, Jace is using illusions to protect himself and scare away the elementals, but not hurt the elementals in the process. That was a purposeful decision that he was trying to make so that he wouldn't hurt Nissa / hurt Nissa's feelings, right? Like, be like, listen, I still need her as an ally. I want her as an ally and a friend. I'm not trying to hurt these elementals. I'm just trying to save my own, like, protect myself enough to live so that, you know, I can talk to her again later. So I'm not going to hurt these elementals, but I need to live as well because these things are trying to hurt me, so.
But to the point that I just made, I mean, he was using the trauma that those elementals had experienced against them.
Yeah, he was using fire, which in general makes sense except for the water elementals, but you know, as to why those elementals might be afraid of fire, that's not exactly the trauma response. But in terms of the Eldrazi, which he was creating illusions of Eldrazi, that was enough to scare them away.
And that's real fucked up.
Yeah.
That's a real fucked up thing to do.
Right.
And then you mentioned that Nahiri was impressed by that, and I thought that you initially had said that Nissa was impressed by that, and I was very mad about that. I was like, there's no way in hell that Nissa would be okay with him doing that to the elementals.
Yeah.
Like, there's no way that she would be like, oh, it's impressive that he would use that tool to manipulate them and keep them from hurting him.
Right.
Like,
Nahiri would be impressed by that, absolutely.
Yes, Nahiri would.
Yeah.
And I actually agree that that's correct characterization there.
Yeah. I think that...
Even though for most of these stories that are proceeding, and for the beginning part of this story,
I really, really felt that a lot of mischaracterizations were occurring.
And I also, you mentioned that you thought I mentioned that it was Nissa who was impressed, and it's totally possible that I may have said Nissa instead of Nahiri. I've been mixing them up so much.
It's difficult. They have similar names. They have the same fucking
motivations.
Yes, motivations.
Goals.
They're both trying to do the exact same thing, and you keep saying sort of, but it's not. It's the exact same fucking thing. It's just that.
The way that they're...
Well, we'll get there.
Yeah.
We'll get there.
Well, and the result of what they
Plenty to say about it.
The result of what they each want to do would be different. In the old Zendikar coming back for Nahiri, or what we get for Nissa.
The whole reason why I was upset about this whole thing is because there's no reason for them to be fighting in the first place. If they were to sit down and have a fucking conversation about what they both wanted to do, none of this would happen. If they just sat down and said, look, we both have Zendikar's best interests in mind when we're trying to do these things, let's just compromise and figure out a way that we can both just make this plane actually better together, like the whole thing would be fine. But that goes back to the trauma response thing where they're needlessly fighting because they don't know how to be rational about what it is that they're trying to do. Because they have no frame of reference for that, because the only people they really have ever interacted with in either of their lives have been either awkward as fuck relationships with them or seriously manipulative relationships with them. So they don't have a basis for knowing how to have constructive conversations with people in a way where they can compromise and convince each other of something without manipulating one another or without getting needlessly defensive or fighting about it, because they never had that frame of reference. All they had was them against the world.
Okay.
So it just feeds back into that theory of all of these things being based on these trauma responses that, makes perfect sense for what actually happened to Zendikar and what actually happened to these women.
Okay. Interesting. It's funny. And please don't misunderstand either you or all of you. This is not a complaint by any means. It is an observation, and it will lead into the next thing that we're about to talk about. I feel like at this point in JaAR, this is probably the least I've spoken in like all of the JaARs prior to this, and I am 100% okay with that, because people have correctly said in the comments of JaARs, like, hey, we want to hear more from Amy, etc. Amy's really, you're really passionate about this right now. And it's something that you know well and you know a lot about, and so you want to be able to talk about it. I'm 100% here for that. Let me pretend that I'm not here. And by that I mean, I'll talk more later. Don't worry. I've got
I want to
stuff
work through
here.
the notes. I want to hit the points that
Absolutely.
are existing in the notes.
Absolutely.
And then, feed it back into this theory that...
Right. And I
kind of confirmed with this story.
Right. And I like that this is this way, because the next thing in the notes to talk about is Jace.
Yeah, so from the beginning, I felt like, Jace, why the fuck is he here? There's no reason for it at all. Except for, I was so mad because I was like, Nahiri and Nissa, there's no reason for them to be fighting. If they just talked about what it is they both wanted, they could figure out a way to make it work and just make Zendikar a better place. And instead, they're just the emotional women fighting one another, and the guy has to come in and be the voice of reason and tell them, oh, they shouldn't be fighting, everything's cool. It just seemed like a load of crap, straight up. And it wasn't until the end of the story that I changed my mind.
Okay.
So we'll get to that point.
Sure. But yeah, I thought that was, because Amy brought it up, and it was something that I had, like, slightly felt in the back of my mind, and then when Amy brought those points up, I was like, that's no more waffling on it. Yeah, that definitely is what it felt like.
Yeah, because
at
from
the time,
beginning, it felt like there was no reason for him to actually be there.
Right. And that's how I felt at this point in the story when Jace is with Nahiri in the Singing City, right? Nahiri fortifies herself in the Singing City, and Jace is in there talking to her, and eventually shuts down her mind or locks her up and paralyzes her so that he can take the core and leave. And then Nissa ends up getting it or whatever. Like but at that moment, that's when you and I were kind of talking about that, is when Jace was in there kind of mentally sparring with Nahiri and arguing with her, and you were like, why the hell does this have to be the case? And I fully agreed at that moment, and so we'll see what you mean by, that changing maybe slightly at the end.
Right.
So, something else that came up that we were talking about, one of the lines that Nissa used, and then it comes up again later with Nahiri, but Nissa says to Jace, Nahiri is not known for her truthfulness, Jace.
Yeah.
That combined with Nahiri later telling Jace, and Nahiri kind of threw jabs at Nissa and at Jace at two separate points, right? She says to Nissa that Nissa kind of destroys everything she touches, right? That was one thing. And then says to Jace later, whenever you try to do good, it just makes things worse. So those were two lines that, or a couple of instances, right? Two instances from Nahiri and one from Nissa. And I mean, maybe I'm not remembering well enough the story from original Zendikar through, like, Zendikar, Worldwake, and Rise of the Eldrazi. Maybe I'm not remembering those stories well enough, but I don't think, we both don't think,
Right.
that Nahiri knows Nissa and Jace well enough for any of these statements to be making that much, like, to be made.
Right.
And yet, they're arguably accurate statements, but it's similar to, it reminds me, and it harkens back to War of the Spark, where you have Rat, like, making these statements about these planeswalkers.
Right. It's just
that
for
makes no
convenience.
sense.
It's just for convenience.
To pass that information along to us.
They need the story to go this certain way. So they're going to say these things because the characters who are in the story need to say those things. Not because the characters who are in the story actually know enough to say those things.
Now, again, like I said, if there's something I'm not remembering from Zendikar, where they, like, spent a bunch of time together or whatever.
Right, like, I would love to know if there's a portion of the older stories that I'm not remembering where Nahiri was prominent in them, doing stuff, or witnessing even what Jace and Nissa were trying to do.
Right.
Fighting the Eldrazi, stuff like that.
Right. So,
literally any of it. I would love to hear about all of it in the comments, if there's stuff I'm forgetting, because I feel like I'm not.
So that's what I was going to say. So if you remember, that's what this motion was. I didn't want to interrupt. But yeah, leave that in the comments for us if that's something that you remember and that it harkened back to for you, and so we're just missing something. We would love to know that, because otherwise our point is, how do they know this about each other, and or is it just a way to get us as readers, all of us, to kind of have this point more hammered home.
Right.
And so you have the character saying it, even though it's not technically something they would know that in depth. Okay, just want to make sure. Oh my goodness. Okay, so now we're getting towards the end, right? And so I guess we can let you get to your points about the end. I don't want to.
Well, I mean,
unless
isn't there
you're
a bunch
talking
more
about
stuff on there?
Well, so I was up to this now. So did you want to, like, that was all that I have at this point. Like, so for while you're thinking about that, right? And I'll let you even look at this if you want, because I'll talk for a second.
Okay.
One thing that bothered me, kind of outside of the actual meat and potatoes of the story, and I'll say bothered me. It's not like, oh my God, it makes it the worst ever. It was just something that I noticed and I wanted to at least point out. you had at least one story spotlight element in this story, and that was Nahiri's Binding, right? Which is a great card from the set, for limited at least. And is the story spotlight. And back in my day, I remember back when the story spotlights were numbered, first of all, which I'm not saying I want to go back to that necessarily. I don't mind story spotlights being done the way they're done now, but if you're going to do a story spotlight and then you're going to do a story with that story spotlight in it, show me the card.
Right.
Or just the art from that card. But this story in particular, as your fifth and final story, had no art.
Right. The resolution.
None.
And let me just say at this moment, and I won't elaborate on it until we've gotten to that point in this video, let me just say the resolution to this story is extremely important.
Fair.
Extremely important.
Fair. I don't know that there's any art for the resolution necessarily, but
they could put some art in this story.
Correct.
Since this story is the story with the resolution.
Correct. And that in my opinion, that always enhances the experience. For me personally. I just appreciate it. All right. Joe likes pictures in the art. Like, you know, like I like stories with pictures in them. No, like
Fourthos are people who love the stories and the art.
Yeah. Yeah. And other things as well. But yes, I would have appreciated the art, and it stood out to me greatly that it wasn't present at all.
Yeah.
At all. Like, not even if the Nahiri's Binding art was the only thing that was the picture in this whole thing, that's happened before, right? One or two pieces of art or whatever. I mentioned earlier in this series that I was a little upset that they used stills from the trailer instead of card art, and yet I'd rather have that.
Right,
Like,
that
give
was
me
way better
something.
than nothing.
Yeah. And the stills from the trailer were coupled with other art. If I remember correctly, there were 11 pictures in that one story. 6 of them were from the trailer and 5 were not. You can go back and watch that other episode. It's in my notes
what
somewhere.
A contrast from that to a story with 0.
None. And it's your finale.
Yeah.
Like, you would think that you would want that imagery and those images, except if, and I don't know that I necessarily agree with this, but I'm pointing it out because it's something that's been brought up in the past about, like, Throne of Eldraine, and Theros Beyond Death doesn't count, but Throne of Eldraine and Ikoria, which is that back then, for those two sets, the story was so far removed from the set itself that the teams didn't talk to each other. And so there wasn't the availability of having enough art to fill those story pages. I'm not saying that I don't know if that's definitively the case, but that's the only thing that I can think of, is that you got to this resolution, this big fight here at the end, and there's nothing. There's no art for it. There's no anything for it. Nahiri's Binding is the only thing that I could pinpoint and say, oh, well, that card is here in this story, so that art should have been there, which I still agree with. But I could get that if that's the only art you were going to put in there, that maybe they felt that that would be more striking of a difference, that it was one piece of art and only one piece of art, because it's the only art in the entirety of every card that was released in this set that has anything at all to do with this final story, the wrap-up of everything that led us to this point. And yet the thumbnail, if you will, on Wizards' website for this article was the art from the showcase version of Nissa, of Shattered Bows or whatever.
Which was so cool.
Great art, and it's part of our thumbnail for this video
with, like, all the small ones around.
Yes.
Yeah.
So down at the bottom and everything.
So cool.
So, and I mean, because it's the thumbnail for this story, it's part of our thumbnail for this video. That's just how we do things. But that art wasn't even in this story.
Right.
And we'll talk about that in a second, but I want you to be able to get to your points about the ending here.
Well, so, okay. So the end of the story changed my mind about all of it. So my mindset going into reading these stories the 5 of them.
Sure.
5, correct?
Yeah.
Yes. Was why? I kept on asking the question, why is this happening? Why are these two women interacting? Because there's no real explanation of why they're coming together, how they did this, the conversations that would have happened to lead to it. They just skip to the bullet points that they want to hit. And, you know, it was very frustrating. And I felt like there was a lot of mischaracterization for Nahiri. And I still feel that way. Because I really do feel like, even towards the end of this story where they basically decided that Nahiri couldn't be helped. Well, like, just let her go, like, she's gonna be mad now, and, you know, there's no convincing her that there's, you know, a different way to do this. And that's not true. Like I said, none of this fighting would have had to occur if the two of them had just actually had a real conversation about what it is they both wanted. And I think that it would have taken a little bit away from the sort of ending that they wanted to create here. They really wanted to focus on that. These people are traumatized. This world is traumatized. Here's the reaction to that, and here's what needs to be done about it aspect. And I didn't know that the entire time, because in 5 stories, they didn't say it until the last half of the 5th story, which is great, actually, because I spent the first 4.5 sitting there going, what the fuck to all of it? And sitting there going, like, why the fuck is Jace here? Like, these two women are the furthest thing from damsels. They don't need this dude coming in here and pretending like he gives a damn about Zendikar, because he don't. And then, like, but it was actually perfect, because in the end, they finally said, like, Nissa learned that, I mean, Nissa knew that Zendikar wasn't broken. Zendikar was perfect the way it was. She just wanted to kind of, like, fix some of the corruption that happened from the Eldrazi and, like, let it just, you know, prosper on its own, grow back, and what have you. But she finally, like, came to the conclusion that it's okay if that corruption exists. You don't really have to go through and fix it, because being okay with the fact that it exists is what allows it to heal.
Sure.
So that's how it fits into that trauma framework.
Okay.
Right? You can't heal from your trauma unless you're able to accept the fact that it happened and your reactions to it. So all of the ways in which you are fucked up because of that trauma are things you have to accept and learn how to love in order for you to heal from the trauma. And then they can get better. But you have to first be okay with them not getting better. Does that make sense? It's very weird and hard, which is why it's a thing that a lot of people can't do. But they kind of said that they gave up on Nahiri. They basically just said, she will never get to that point. She will never be able to make those acceptances and heal her trauma.
Because she's just fueled by revenge at this point.
And the thing of it is, that's not realistic. Everyone can get to that point, but they need to be able to interact with people that understand enough that it's a process for them to get to that point. And so It's a very nuanced thing, which is why it's very difficult for people to work on trauma. But as someone who has, that was actually a pretty accurate depiction of it. Like, I know that there are people that I'm kind of having to leave behind, even though they have similar experiences to me, because it makes me unable to heal my own trauma. Consistently trying to take them with me to a point of being healthy. And because they're not ready to come yet. So, Nahiri's just not ready to come yet.
And hopefully...
I kind of wish that they had, like, honed in on that just a little bit more and, like, given some actual, like, dialogue and reasoning behind why they kind of came to that conclusion. I felt like they kind of jumped.
Okay.
You know, like, there wasn't enough meat there.
Sure. Well, and that's a point I'll bring up in a bit.
But maybe that kind of proves the point a little bit, too. Like, maybe we'll see Nahiri again, and that meet will be able to happen. Because she'll be closer to being ready to come. Does that make sense?
Sure.
But I know there's more I'm trying to say on this, but I feel like I'm forgetting pieces of it. Maybe start going through some of these things and I'll see if I have more to say on.
So, this is the end, right? There were 5 stories, that's it. There were 4 side stories, that's it. I feel personally like this was a good start. And by that I mean a good return to web fiction, a good start at getting back to the place where we were, the place that we've all been asking for them to return to since the second they got rid of it. I have said since it happened, even though I feel like there's a large portion of people, and maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like from what I've heard that there's a large portion of people in the Vorthos community who are saying just bring back the in-house team. I do not think that's going to happen.
No, I don't think anyone thinks that's going to happen.
And I'm not going to hold my and I'm not going to hold my breath for it either.
Right.
And so I think that with this new form of storytelling, new old form of storytelling, that this is fine for now. And if and when it becomes not fine, we'll be one of the first to tell you about it.
We will.
Or if you feel that it's not fine at whatever point, either right now or as it comes up in the future, we hope that we'll be one of the first that you tell as well, because we want to be able to have that discussion. We want to be able to hear people's opinions and points and etc. But I will say that I think this is a lot better than purchasable ebooks that have very little to do with the actual story themselves. Like I said, I think that there's an argument to be made that there are aspects of this one that don't fully coordinate perfectly, but I think it's better. I think it's a step in the right direction, and I know that if we compare this in the Zendikar Rising story to Dominaria, which was the first story in the new direction that they went in previously, Dominaria's stories were awful.
Yeah.
Just awful. And they took a well-established plane and just toasted it. And it was so frustrating with the stories that they put out for that. And this one is, in comparison, a beautiful breath of fresh air. Does it mean that it's Ixalan, Rivals of Ixalan, Hour of Devastation, and Amonkhet levels of story? No. But it's a step in the right direction, in my opinion, at least.
So, do you want to keep talking about that specific point, or were you about to move to another one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So, I will argue that point by saying I felt up until the second half of this story that it was, yes, better than Dominaria, but anything would be.
Theros Beyond Death stories are better than Dominaria.
Well.
Oh, there are none. Anyway, go on.
Anyway. I said anything, and if they don't exist, that's not an anything.
There's story spotlight cards. It counts, right? There's the blurbs that they release alongside the cards.
Stop.
Sorry.
It's choking now. Okay.
Sorry. Oh, that's great.
What was I saying?
I'm so sorry. I knew I was
Okay.
derailing you.
So, up until the second half of this story, I agreed that these stories were in no way what they needed to be. But that's because they waited until that final, 2 paragraphs or whatever the hell it was to finally tie off the loose ends that I needed them to tie off. You've got a lot of questions here.
Oh, I do.
Of things that you're like, what the hell? They never explained this shit. But the things that I cared about them really tying off came to a close and made those stories good.
And I like that. I like that we can have that shared perspective of Amy being like, no, I'm good now. Thank you. And having me be like, wait, but what about...
I like that too, because these stories brought back... I was so passionate about these stories because I'm so passionate about the plane. I'm so passionate about these characters. And I was so passionate about the fact that we didn't fucking have stories. And so I was so ready for these stories to come back.
Ravenous. Just wanting them.
But also scared that they would fuck them up entirely. And the whole time I thought that they did. And then I was proven wrong. And that's exactly what I fucking want. Because... it allows me to stay passionate throughout.
Mm-hmm.
I'm passionate about how crappy the stories are until you prove me wrong at the end, and then I can be so passionate about being proven wrong.
Okay. And it's interesting, too. I don't want to cut you off if you have more to say.
I will, but...
Okay. I think that there's a fair contrast, because Amy will, I assume, back me up on this one. Please. No.
I mean, if you want it that bad...
No, it's fine. I would say that Amy and I had a lot of discussions pre-filming of JaAR. And I don't mean just this episode. I mean all 5 of these that we did for this series of stories. We had a lot of discussions pre-filming of Amy being like, but why did they do this? And why did they do this? And I felt like my role in this was apologizing for it and or trying to come up with answers
right,
for
trying
them.
to defend them.
Yeah.
To me,
like being an apologist.
What the fuck?
Yeah. Yeah. And so I guess we both kind of flipped, right?
Yeah.
So not that I disliked this. It's not that, although we'll talk about it because I don't know. I really don't know. Like I said, I still truly believe this is a step in the right direction, and I appreciated it. But you're saying
you have a lot of questions at the end that you feel needed to be answered that weren't, and the things that I really cared about them answering, they answered. So I'm satisfied, and you're not.
I'm not. Well, and because I really was sitting there the whole time, and I was like, okay, I can explain this away. I can explain this concern away that Amy has, and I can. And so going all throughout, I didn't have as much of a problem with the earlier stories as Amy did. And now that we're here and it's done, now that we're at the end, I'm sitting there going, wait, but what about, and what about, and what about, and what about? So can we delve into that, or did you want to continue what you were saying, please?
Before we do, I'll say I'm so happy with how this story ends because you finally learn why Jace is there.
Mm-hmm.
Jace is there because of his experiences with Liliana and Vraska. He's already been through this.
Mm-hmm.
He already learned how to come out of his traumatic experiences.
Sure.
He's already been through that. He had to learn the hard way, already, that he couldn't trust Liliana. That loving her is something that will go away when he is confident enough in himself to not need the constant control that she placed upon him.
Mm-hmm.
and be able to have that much agency over himself. You know, he learned all that already. And so him showing up here is actually perfect. Because now he's there while these two women have to learn this lesson as well.
Sure.
And so Nissa kind of learns it in this story, although I wish they had kind of gone into it more deeply and like made it make a bit more sense, the actual process of it.
Mm-hmm.
And Nahiri still kind of has to come to that point.
Mm-hmm.
But so it's actually perfect that Jace was here, because Jace has experienced that same exact thing that the two of them have already experienced, and they're all at different points in the process
Mm-hmm.
of learning how to get through it and move on.
Right.
So I just wish that like there had been more communication amongst the three of them to kind of hammer that home a little bit.
Sure.
But like I said, if we see Nahiri again, when she's closer to a point of being ready to have that conversation, then maybe that conversation can happen and it can be organic and wonderful and not feel so much like they just kind of said things and made people come to conclusions that felt under-supported.
Okay.
Like there wasn't enough actually written in words in the story to prove why they would come to that conclusion.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
But, so Jace being here was actually exactly what it needed. I wish that, kind of going back to what you said,
Mm-hmm.
that it's a nice start, right?
Yeah.
I wish that there had been more stories, that they had gone more deeply into it, that they had described things more precisely and given more support to decisions and conclusions that were made.
Mm-hmm.
So that they could really lean into what the theme of this actually was. But I do like that, in contrast to what I just said, I will argue my other point against myself to say that I actually really like that they didn't lean into it as heavily as I'm also saying they should have,
Mm-hmm.
and waited until the end and just like made it a huge plot twist.
Okay.
Like they extracted the theme from the story and then forced it back in when they thought it would be the most surprising to do that.
Okay.
So they made it incredibly more interesting that way, especially for people who don't necessarily understand that that's the theme. If they have no concept of these characters or Zendikar or trauma responses or any of that stuff,
Sure.
then maybe this was a lot more digestible for them.
Okay.
Than what I would have wanted.
Sure.
But at the same time, I'm really impressed with how they did what they actually did. And I like a lot that it sort of flipped the whole thing on its head and reinfused that theme back in and made you go, oh shit, okay. Now I get all of the things that I was pissed off about before. Now I get it.
Okay.
And that even fits into that theme.
Okay.
Because the theme is these people having reactions, fierce reactions to things.
Right.
And then not realizing until the end that those fierce reactions weren't what actually made sense. And they needed to come to those realizations
Mm-hmm.
that fierce reactions don't fix things. What fixes things is fixing things. So, like, the fact that they did it that way could even be analyzed more and and taken as yet another way of fitting into that theme.
Okay.
And maybe, you know, the gods smiled on the storytellers and it just happened that way.
Right. Okay.
You know, or maybe it was actually as deliberate as the deep analysis that I'm putting upon it. And even if it wasn't, you know, I'm perfectly happy with either of those results. I'm perfectly happy with the storytellers being that incredible with it.
Sure.
Or divine intervention being able to make me make that analysis of
Sure,
it.
because the end is still the same.
Right.
The end result is still the same,
Right.
is that you have this.
And
to
I'm
look at.
now able to sit here on the JaAR set and say, after so many stories and so much time, I'm now able to sit here on the JaAR set again and say that I can be proud of the product that was given to us. I can now sit here and say, thank you to the storytellers for creating a story that will speak to the audience to this degree.
Okay.
And I think the last time was probably Ixalan.
Okay.
The last time I can feel like,
Okay.
you know,
Yeah.
when Jace's memories were flooding and Veraska was seeing that, or yeah, those stories were the last time I could say that.
Mm-hmm.
I could feel that way.
Sure.
And so this is the first time I can come back and say yes, okay, because this story sort of picked up where they left off all those times ago.
Okay. Sure.
And brought it back.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. Absolutely. So, is that good? Again, I still don't.
Yeah, I think so.
jump in on
Like,
it here.
yeah, like you can go through these things,
Okay.
and if I have anything to say on them, I will. But
You got it. So, with the end of this story, right? We're done now. Let's look at it overarchingly. There were 5, mainline and 4 side. I think, as I mentioned with the side story earlier, I think that, again, still step in the right direction. I think that this shows how side stories can be going forward, what it means to introduce these legendary creatures, these legendary characters, to have, like, main story main character legendary characters in the side stories, as well as legendary villain characters like Nezahal, or not Nezahal, that was from a different set, Joe. The Verazal, that's the one that sounds like a drug. Verazal and the Hydra in this story as well, or today as well. Yeah, exactly.
Hydroxycut.
And so you can have those like creature-based legendaries that are creatures that they're fighting against that still give them this. You can still characterize those creatures as these like mythical creatures that are super difficult to fight and to beat, and you can still have your main story or your main characters in those stories be prominent and be able to actually like talk and stuff, and so they can tell you who they are based on their dialogue, etc. So I think those were a good start. But at the end of this main story, right, story number 5, I'm sitting here with a lot of questions, and I'm like, okay, so where are we now? Back when they were doing the interconnected like gatewatch going from place to place to place, right? The next place that we're going to is the Viking world, whose name will always escape me until we get started with it, because I just, they dropped a lot of information all at once on that one day of all the places where we were going. And so the next world that we're going to is the Viking world, if I recall correctly, which I'm relatively certain I do. And so, I guess inherently based on how they reveal information. We don't know who's going to be there. So we don't know if it's going to be Jace, if it's going to be Nahiri, if it's going to be Nissa. I doubt it's any of them. Based on how they've been doing it, they don't necessarily want the same Planeswalker 2 sets in a row anymore, because people were upset with the Gatewatch, and so they wanted to move away from that to make people happier in that regard.
Yeah, but then people were upset about that too, so...
I mean, I never thought it needed to not... Like, I think that the storytellers who were telling the Gatewatch stories should have been at least allowed to finish, because otherwise you get that. And that is not where any of those storytellers wanted to be.
Yeah,
I have
it was a nightmare for everyone.
I have no inside information on that. I'm just alive and can read
cognizant
things.
of what has happened.
Right. And they wanted to tell those stories, those Gatewatch stories. They were leading up to something. They were increasing the characterization of the characters that they were working with, and then they got their legs cut out from under them, and it got given to somebody else, and it immediately got screwed up. Horribly.
Well, that's the other thing I wanted to talk
Sure.
about. The fact that they actually mentioned Nissa's relationship with Chandra a couple of times in this story.
Correct. Again, that's 100% them backpedaling and attempting to apologize.
Right.
I'm not okay with it.
They didn't do it very well either.
No, because they said losing Chandra's love. Except that in the story that you're trying to overwrite there, Chandra said that she never loved her, essentially. It was like, well, she always wanted men. So I don't...
She didn't have a dick, so even though I loved her, who cares?
No. So I'm not interested in these stories attempting to fix that. I think that that's something that that's a different situation. And that's me personally.
They're pandering a little bit there.
They're pandering a lot of it.
Yeah.
That's fine.
I don't even... I can't even say they're pandering a lot there, because I think if they were, they would have said more about it.
Sure.
They would have, elaborated on it, and they didn't.
Right. So now you have Nissa on her home plane, arguably, and maybe it only comes up with Jace's fear of having to fight Bolas again, which I hope is not something they do anytime soon. I just can't imagine how that would come up and why, right? I mean, Bolas exists still, and it's still a problem, so that's fair. But between Bolas and, Emrakul as, loose threads that need to be tied up, even with Tezzeret, I don't think it makes sense, but with Bolas and with Emrakul, those are the only times that I can see Nissa having any place coming back into any story ever again at this point.
Yeah.
And that's not distaste for her.
What about
I'm just saying.
Dovin?
Dovin's dead.
Oh, yeah.
What are you talking about? Dovin's dead. Sorry, I just kicked you. I see
and
no
so is Yahenni,
point.
so that's not a story beat that they could go back to either.
So, again, unless they're trying to really remedy this by bringing Chandra and Nissa's relationship back into play, which, again, doesn't seem like they're interested in doing.
I don't think so.
No. So, the only time I can now see Nissa ever being in a Magic story again is returning to Zendikar, being sought after against a new fight against Bolas, or because of the Emrakul situation. In coming out of the moon
or
somehow.
Nahiri coming back.
Why would Nahiri coming back necessitate Nissa doing anything?
Because it would tie into this story.
So, like I said, so then a return to Zendikar.
It wouldn't necessarily be on Zendikar. In fact, I'm pretty convinced it wouldn't be.
I think if Nahiri comes back, it's going to be against Sorin again.
Well, yeah, unfortunately.
So I just don't I don't see any world where we get Nissa back again anytime soon. And that's some people may think that's fine. Some people may not. Right. But that's what I'm saying. This is one of your main characters. What's next for her? What's the point of sorry, that's not fair. The what's the point is not fair. She saved her home plane. She did an amazing job, and this is a very nice way to end it for her. But that's the point. It seems like it's the end for her.
Right.
What is the point of having her back again? So
what is there left for her to do?
Right. So that's where I see Nissa. With Jace, he has the core. It is inert, but maybe can be reawakened. Who knows? He's going to presumably now return to Ravnica with it, now that it is irrelevant to Zendikar since it's been used. Maybe he returns to Ravnica with it, studies it further as he wanted to, and does attempt to use it as a weapon against a future fight against Bolas. Maybe. And also, I wrote this down, he learned to listen more, I guess, but probably not, because they need him to be that...
like, shoehorned in.
Yeah, they need him to be that kind of flawed character in that way for many reasons.
Which sucks, because that kind of combats the whole point that I was making before, where it makes sense for him to be there, because he's already gone through this process that Nissa's now going through, and that Nahiri still has to go through.
Right.
So he was the voice of reason, but he was the voice of reason at the wrong points. They really didn't use him the way that they should have used him.
Right.
It was appropriate for him to be there if they were going to use him effectively, which I don't feel that they really did. Because if they're going to sit there and say, oh, well, I should have listened more. Yeah, you should have, but you also would have known that going in.
Right.
Because of the fact that you've been through this before.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so like, but maybe showing up in the moment that he showed up, he had to like be there long enough to learn that that's what was happening there. So, maybe.
I don't know. And so when do we see Jace next? On when we go to Vryn at some point, maybe.
Or on Ravnica tinkering with the like
well,
useless cube.
I'm talking about what set are we going to see him in?
Right.
Like, they're not going back to Ravnica anytime soon.
No.
They went 3 sets in a row there after saying they weren't doing blocks anymore.
Right.
So that's not happening. Maybe Vryn, maybe there's another situation, and so Jace just shows up on sets with powerful artifacts that he thinks he can kind of collect to fight Bolas again, a la Urza with the legacy weapon. Maybe, maybe not, who knows? And then Nahiri. And for Nahiri, kind of as Amy pointed out, you know, she didn't really seem to grow from this experience in any capacity. And so, you know, does she, the next time we see her, is she going to fight Soren? Is she going to fight Nissa? Is she going to fight Jace? Because that's kind of how this story ended, was her, like, going off into the sunset, turning around, planeswalking away, as she says she, meaning Nissa, had no right to use that. Right, to use the core in that way.
Yeah, because that's a stone thing that my people made.
But it's just another failure for her.
Yeah.
She just failed again, and it was to protect her home plane. So again, this story called The Two Guardians, and Jace is the one who said, you know, helping these 2 guardians of Zendikar or whatever, and yet Nahiri didn't grow at all from this experience. She didn't learn anything. She didn't learn that she shouldn't have used the core. She didn't stay to see how good Zendikar was becoming, even without returning it to the old ways. Kind of going back to your trauma discussion, the one thing that I kind of thought of throughout this was I was reminded of the stories from Battle for Zendikar and Oath of the Gatewatch, or no, actually, it was from Eldritch Moon, I guess, when we heard about Nahiri's life, right? And we heard about her being trapped on Zendikar, as we've discussed many times. But then we also heard about her trapped in the Hell Vault. And that one of the things that she did while she was trapped in the Hell Vault, to keep herself sane, if you will, while she was just, in her mind, kind of eternally trapped there,
Right.
Was she recreated her Zendikar.
Right.
And I thought back to that a lot from these stories. A lot. Because when she was in the Hell Vault, again, trauma, she's trapped in this void space after being betrayed further by her mentor, or at least coming to realize the betrayal. Mm-hmm. She's trapped in the Hell Vault, and she goes, I guess for lack of a better term, she like goes to her happy place.
Yeah.
To be able to get through it. She retreats into her own mind and step by step recreates the entirety of Zendikar in her brain as she remembers it. Mm-hmm. But don't forget, how does she remember it? The way that it was. The way that she was trying to get it back to in this set of stories. And it's probably, again, I don't have the type of experiences that Amy has, but I'm going to do my best here. And if I'm wrong, I'm willing to be corrected one way or another by all of you or by... Yeah, exactly. Right. And so, but I'll preface it by saying that I don't have, the knowledge here. I'm just going to do my best based on my readings and my kind of conclusions that I've drawn.
And being married to me.
Yes, exactly. and hearing your experiences as much as I could and have. Nahiri had an image in her mind of what she remembered her home to be. Mm-hmm. She recreated that image as her happy place, and then returned to her home to find that it was nothing like that. It was damaged, it was torn, it was broken, and it was in pain. And so in her mind, she needed to get that back to the way that it was. Because that's her home, is the one that's in her head, that she recreated over however many hundreds of years she was trapped inside this hell vault. And then she tried to do so. And she killed along the way to try to get there. Zareth, she didn't technically kill him herself, but didn't really care that he died. Right. Akiri, not dead, but she absolutely tried to kill her. Mm-hmm. Killed, or would have killed, to get what she wanted. Tried to kill Nissa, arguably. I mean, she threw lots of swords at her, so I'm pretty sure if the elementals hadn't stopped it, that would have killed Nissa. So Nahiri was trying so desperately to get back to what she knew that she would have killed. Because in her mind, that is what Zendikar is. Not what it should be, not what it needed to be, but what it is, and she needed to get it back to that point. Because she wanted her happy place in reality as opposed to just in the recesses of her mind.
She wanted what she had before that trauma occurred.
And instead, what she got in this story, which again, hopefully, gives the storytellers an opportunity to boost her further in the next time that we see her, but all she got in this one was another failure. And like the most extreme failure, because now there is no way to return Zendikar to the way that it was, and hopefully she learned, although I there's no way of knowing, but hopefully she learned that nobody wants it the way that you want it. Nobody. Akiri as a core didn't want what you wanted. Nissa as an elf on Zendikar and as one of the guardians of Zendikar, a planeswalker, doesn't want what you wanted and got what she wanted instead. And if and when she comes back, she being Nahiri, comes back to Zendikar and finds that everyone there is happy with the world because the royal is gone and the plane is the way that they all remember it being prior to the Eldrazi coming out, Nahiri's going to be upset, I feel like, because it's not the world that she expects it to be. It's not her happy place that she wants it to be. But yet it is a happy place for so many other people that it would be hard to deny that that's the way that it should be right now.
Well, so in order to relate that to the trauma response theme theory.
Sure.
So Nissa's trauma was like a one-time thing. It was, I let the Eldrazi out of their bindings, we'll say.
Imprisonment, whatever you want to call it, sure. Sure.
And it destroyed my home. Mm-hmm. And now I'm trying to fix what I have done, but really just the hurt that was caused by this being the way that it was. Nahiri's trauma is very different because her trauma kept on happening and was consistent and never ended. And in the truest way that can possibly be. You know, as someone who has complex PTSD, which is the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD is like one traumatizing occurrence that you repeatedly go back to. Mm-hmm. And complex PTSD is you consistently are traumatized. And you're not just traumatized by the memory of the one traumatizing experience. you're re-traumatized by new experiences on a consistent basis. So that changes a little bit your ability to kind of come back from that. Mm-hmm. So Nahiri's much more far gone. And that makes perfect sense because she spent so much time in those headspaces. She created her happy place, right? She still needs to come to that conclusion like Nissa sort of did in this, even though Nissa kind of already knew it, that you never get to go back. You mm-hmm. never get to be or experience life the way it was before you were traumatized. All you get is to a point of being able to love and accept what has happened before and the person it has made you, so that you can heal and move forward, and you will be very different from what you were, but you will be much better in the future than you are now. Mm-hmm. So Nahiri just doesn't understand that yet. Mm-hmm. And that makes perfect sense. I mean, there's literally been no reason for her to have been able to come to that conclusion. There's no interactions whatsoever in any story or in any card. There's been no indication whatsoever of her being given the opportunity to learn this. Mm-hmm. And it touched on it slightly here, but she didn't learn it. So we'll see how in the future she can take the little teensy bit of knowledge that got planted mm-hmm. from this story, and it might go on to affect her and make her learn this, or it might not, because mm-hmm. it might not have been enough to make her learn that. Mm-hmm. What was I trying to get back to? Where was the point that I was trying to go? Her trying to recreate that happy place, that home, isn't a thing that you can ever do. What was home, and they specifically mentioned it in this story and fucking said it. They used the word home, which made it feel so great, because if you do trauma work, or if you watch videos on YouTube of the right people who know what they're talking about, trying to help people do trauma work, they refer specifically to being able to go home. At one point in my process, I explained my pain to my therapist as being homesick for a home that never existed. And that home doesn't exist until you get to that point of being able to do the accepting of what has already happened, understand it, accept that it happened to you, accept who you are now, and you might not love yourself yet. You might not be to that point yet, right? But having that acceptance is what allows you to see that home that exists. Mm-hmm. And I'm still not to the point of having that compassion and that love for myself that I need, but I can see the home exists because I have enough acceptance for what's occurred. And so in this, they kind of really specifically referenced that, and it was great. They did an amazing job, because Nissa got to go home. She got to be home, which means that she reached that acceptance of what happened to her, what happened to Zendikar, the acceptance of what it is now, and then the healing process as well, which was what happened to Zendikar once she used the core. So it was the acceptance and then the healing process, which is the compassion, the self-love, right? So that's the healing process part. And so she went home. So it's exactly what people who do trauma work explain the process to be.
Okay.
Okay?
Sure.
So, yeah, so Nahiri's home isn't that happy place that she was creating. That happy place that she was creating to help her through that process. And she's still nowhere near the point of getting home. And that home is going to be completely different.
Sure.
Than that happy place was.
Very true. Yeah. That's a good point. I would say, and you touched on this, and I'll say it more definitively from my perspective. I mentioned step in the right direction. I think that these 5 stories were not enough. I think that it could have been expanded upon a bit more. It could have been touched on a bit better. But that could also be our bias of just more story.
Right, you want more.
Yeah, just put it in our faces.
And it's definitely my bias too. I mean, I'm able to have this whole conversation about it. So I think there could have been so much more before it would have gotten to a point of there being so much that it was cheapening it, as opposed to helping it, furthering it. But that's because of my bias of I am a traumatized person. I'm going through this process, and the stories that preceded these bioways in time, unfortunately, helped me through the first portion of this process for myself, as a consumer as well as a person who had been through similar things. And now this story's bringing it back to that same thing. So for me, the selfish part of me wants it to be so much more full, and wants it to explain these things so much more in detail, and wants it to have the deep relationships and characterizations that Ixalan had. And deeper still, because it still could be deeper. But that's a selfishness that I'm aware that I have, and a bias that I'm aware that I have, and it's not something that I'm trying to apply to this. It's just, it just exists.
Sure.
So I also understand that it's not that.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with it not being that.
Good.
Because I'm happy with what it did end up being.
Yeah. So that's probably it.
Yeah.
This was a long one. I warned you it was going to be a long one. I warned you it was going to be a long one, but I think it was totally worth it. I don't think you owe anybody an apology, because I think that the information that Amy imparted on all of us, myself included, is very worth it and helps to bring more information to a story that otherwise may not have seemed as deep as it was, and it was. It was much deeper than that. And again, like Amy said, whether that was intentional or not is somewhat irrelevant because we're here. So it doesn't matter whether they meant it to be or didn't mean it to be, it was. And so props to them either way. Because I will say that I was concerned, and I asked this way early on and said I would mention it at the end, so here we are, and I'll touch on it briefly. Because I still don't think so, but my question that I asked a couple of jars ago, because there were only 5 for this one, a couple of jars ago was, did this story need to be written? These 5 stories. Because, again, let's not forget, this is a company that produces products. And Zendikar, the name Zendikar, right, affords certain amounts of guaranteed money for them based on the fact that it is a beloved plane.
Yeah.
Strixhaven coming up.
Beloved by me.
Yes. Strixhaven coming up is an unknown plane. There are certain people who will not be as excited about Strixhaven because they don't know it.
Right.
They know Zendikar. It's a known quantity. They look for the Easter eggs back to what they know from Zendikar. So there's no doubt in my mind why the company would have wanted to go back to Zendikar because of this.
Yeah.
And because it's a well-known plane. The name recognition in and of itself will be enough. Plus, you have at least the concept of like landfall and things like that. You can do expedition type things again. So that much in terms of financially, perfectly understandable as to why you would want to come back. But what about the story side of things? Did this story need to occur? And I thought from the beginning, especially through my discussions with Amy, as I mentioned that we had prior to filming, that I didn't think it did. Yeah. Like, we know that Zendikar wants to be fixed. Or, sorry, that people want Zendikar to be fixed. Both readers here in the real world, as well as characters like Nissa and Nahiri. Arguably, like Jace as well, right? He wouldn't want a plane to be suffering. If he could help it, he would want that plane to get better. That's just Jace as a character. He joined the Gatewatch, or helped found the Gatewatch, or whatever, for kind of that reason, right? There was an extra planar threat that threatened this plane, that injured this plane, and should he want it to get better? Yeah. Does he? Arguably. But we don't know. And so as I mentioned earlier, because this is the point I was leading into earlier. The Gatewatch story, from Battle for Zendikar / Magic Origins, really, but from Magic Origins / Battle for Zendikar until War of the Spark, you had the Gatewatch story. And that story was a story that was planned to be written for a very long time.
Yeah.
The story team that planned to write that story planned it ahead. They knew where they were going with the characters. They knew where those characters were going to end up. They knew the relationships that those characters were going to be forming with one another. Maybe they didn't fully know, right? They didn't exactly know, but they had the shell of it. Right. They knew where they wanted to go with those stories. And things change over time, etc. But obviously the biggest change for that was the new story team coming in and the things that then changed along the way that messed things up drastically.
Yeah.
And that was very unfortunate. Yeah. But you can't say...
That's an understatement.
But you can't say that they didn't want to write those stories. Those stories were stories that they were passionate about writing and that they wanted to tell a full overarching story with. Mm-hmm. What about these? Were these stories written because they were stories that wanted to be told? Or were they just a means to an end? Of, well, Zendikar Rising is coming up and we need a story for Zendikar Rising. What are we going to do? And from that perspective, I don't actually know the answer to the question. Because I felt from the beginning that it wasn't a story that needed to be told. It was a story that they wanted to tell because they were going back to Zendikar and they needed to tell a story.
Because Zendikar.
Right. They wanted Zendikar to be a thing because money.
Right.
And because the fans were asking for it as well. Mm-hmm. Right? I won't just solely put it on, greedy executives. No, like, they wanted to go back to this plane for many different reasons. I just don't know if the story they wanted to tell alongside returning to this plane was one of them. Or if it was just, we need to come up with a story, let's do it, figure it out.
And until the end of the story, I agreed with that.
Right.
I felt that they were writing the story because they needed a story. They made Nahiri the antagonist because they needed an antagonist.
Right.
Despite the fact that I felt that it was mischaracterization of her from the get-go. But now that the end of these stories has come, I feel now the story did need to be told. It needed to be told the way it was told. And it needed to come to that conclusion. And it makes sense that Nahiri is at the point that she's at in the trauma process, that Nissa is at the point that she's at in the trauma process, and that Jace was there. I wish that you saw the point that he was at in his trauma process as well, to round that out and make it make more sense that he was there. But again, it wasn't until the last couple of paragraphs of this story that I could say that I disagreed with that point.
Sure. And I still don't know. I mean, obviously, having heard Amy's impassioned statements, it does make me strongly reconsider, but up until that, I don't know that I had changed my opinion on that. It just, and again, maybe that's my bias and frustration with where the story was previously, and the fact that, that these stories are not written kind of nebulously by the company. They have to be written by individuals, and those individuals can leave, can be fired, can quit, can move on to other jobs, because they're human beings. And the company Wizards of the Coast is one thing, Magic the Gathering as a game is one thing, but the individuals who work on it are very much another. And you can't have, or you don't have, a million Mark Rosewaters in the world where they've been working on the game for 20 plus years, and they're just going to work on it forever, which is what it feels like. And obviously that's not something that is a negative in any way, because congrats to Mark Rosewater, he's doing a great job. But
always,
but you don't have that with every employee at Wizards of the Coast, and so because of that, you're not necessarily going to be able to have a long overarching plan for these stories all the way through. Sometimes it needs to be a means to an end. The thing that sucks is when it's a means to an end with fan favorite planes, fan favorite characters, because it's frustrating in that way. And it's also possible that you completely disagree with my assessment.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear from you if you do, because I want to know. I want to hear other people's opinions on it. Does my feeling come out of left field for you? And you're like, what are you talking about? This story was great. I want to know. I want to know your thoughts. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Are you somewhere in between? Please, as always, let us know any and all of those things down in the comments below.
Yeah.
I cannot tell you what is going to be in this slot next week, this Thursday slot. I can tell you it will be something. That's not a question in my mind. It will be something. Whether it's an MTG Arena video, whether it's another JaAR video, it won't be about the Zendikar Rising story, but it might be something else. And I don't say this for our own benefit. I truly don't know. I'm not like, I know it and I'm just teasing you. But what I encourage you highly to do is to subscribe down below.
Yeah.
Yes, it helps us out, but I'm also saying in terms of like, if you're interested in JaAR,
for stuff like this, it's a little difficult because we don't really know what's happening.
No. But we have a full week to figure it out for ourselves, as well as to see if Wizards is going to figure it out.
Right. But they literally don't tell you
they didn't.
in advance whatsoever.
For the start of this 5-part series, they told you the day before.
Right.
So if that's the case, then
we were like, well, I guess we got to do JaAR again.
Yeah. Which we were totally happy to do, but again, it means that in terms of our schedule and our content schedule, we don't know. Right. We know that a video is coming out on Thursday, but along with subscribing, like I mentioned, you can also ring that bell. And when you do so, you will get notifications whenever our videos come out, because I know for a fact that this video is going to be coming out later than like our noon releases that typically happen on Thursdays, because it's afternoon on Thursday now when we're filming it. Spoilers behind the scenes.
Sorry about it.
But hey, listen,
there was a lot to say about these stories.
So, and look, sometimes that's what happens. Life happens, and I'm not upset about it. I hope you all are fine with it as well, because it's not that big of a deal, in my opinion.
Yeah, I hope you don't take it too personally and you're actually watching this video, because I think this video of all videos is the one to watch.
Right. If you are watching this the day it comes...
obviously, if you're hearing me say that, then you are. But...
If you're watching this the day it comes out or the day after it comes out, so October 1st or October 2nd, please feel free to join us the evening of October 2nd, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. I guess that's night. But 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern for our Friday stream. It will be our last Friday MTG Arena stream. But it will not be our last Friday stream. 8 to 10 p.m., that will be a thing that we will be doing going forward. And all Mondays, from now until further notice, will still be MTG Arena streams Monday nights from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. And we highly encourage you to come hang out with us. We just had our second, this past Monday, our second 7-win draft deck for Zendikar Rising, so we're figuring it out.
Yeah, slowly but surely.
Kind of. And by that I mean, then we lost very handily after that. So, but sometimes you draft well, sometimes you don't. That happens. But
yeah.
You can come join us because it's not all about the gameplay. It's about hanging out. It's about talking with us, talking with your fellow viewers, just having a good time with yourselves and the community. You want to come talk to us about Vorthos stuff, about JaAR stuff,
right.
Whether you agreed or disagreed with this particular episode. We would love to see you.
Love it.
We would love
it.
Yes.
So yeah, it's mainly Joe on cards, me on chat. So pretty much anything you want to talk to me about, I'm up for it.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. So any questions that you might have, you want to just come hang out, you are more than welcome to do so. We would love to have you. Again, subscribing and ringing the bell to get the notifications will also notify you when we go live, so you can see that. But again, 8 to 10 p.m. Mondays and Fridays, or at least this Friday. Fridays in the future will probably still be here, but we'll be doing video game stuff instead of MTG Arena stuff for Video Games for All. So stay tuned for that if that's something you're interested in as well.
Yeah.
Anything else that you might need, links to our socials, links to our other channels like Video Games for All, like Gluten Free for All, like I mentioned, down in the description box below is anything you might need. We highly encourage you, like we said, to stick with us. Check us out next week. We will be back for more. We would love to hear from you. Also, we hope that you enjoyed the return of the Wife Finance Husbundle battle.
Yes, it's been a long time.
From this past Monday. There may be another one this Monday. Just stay tuned. That's what the subscribing and bell ringing is for. So you will see exactly when those come out. We had fun making it. We hope you have fun watching it because I mentioned last week that we were looking at product that needed to be opened, and we sure did. So we hope that everybody enjoyed. Please feel free to leave any and all thoughts that you have, including about this story, about anything that we just talked about, down in the comments below. When you talk about this story, when you talk about these stories and you analyze them and you put forth your own life experiences into them, for better or worse, and you relate them and allow yourself to connect with them in that way, and then connect with your fellow viewers of this show or your fellow readers of those stories, it's a great way to join the rest of the Vorthos community in showing off your...
#Vorthos Pride.
As always, these were cool stories. We were super happy to be back for JaAR, no matter what, because it's something that we love to do. We've been doing it for many years now.
Yeah, and it sucked a lot. Doing JaARs where we just had to say that we hated things or not being able to do them at all. So
yeah,
it's great to be back.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us for any and all of these JaARs that you did. If you're up to this point in the video, props to you. This is a long one, and we really do appreciate you hanging out. Hopefully you are enjoying yourselves. You are continuing, as always, to stay safe and happy and healthy. But yeah, for now, from us here at the Geek for All family of channels, I have been Joe.
And I'm Amy.
And as we always say, in whichever video of ours you watch next, we will see you all next time. Thanks so much, everybody.